Hey there, welcome to the Bible in 5. We're going to be talking about the book of Ezekiel in 2 videos here. The basic themes of what's going on in Ezekiel is very similar to what you read in Isaiah and Jeremiah, the other books of the prophets. What makes Ezekiel unique is a couple of his areas of emphasis, but also when and where he lived. So Ezekiel took place and lived right after the exile has happened. The first wave of exiles has happened into Babylon, and Ezekiel lives in Babylon. And the book begins with one of the more bizarre chapters in the entire Bible, I think, Ezekiel chapter 1. Ezekiel gets a vision of what he calls God's glory, which is a theme that unites the whole book together. And it's a bizarre vision of like some kind of mobile chariot type structure with wheels, except the wheels are these fantastic creatures, and the basis and pillars of the wheels are these creatures that have multiple faces with like animals and humans and so on. Totally bizarre. But on top of this wheeled structure is a throne, and on top of the throne he sees in a cloud and fire and so on, he sees Yahweh. It's very much like the Mount Sinai fire and cloud experience all over again. But the power of this opening of the book here is that Ezekiel is seeing God's personal presence, God's glory, which usually dwells in the temple. He's seeing it and experiencing it in Babylon. He's sitting by a river in Babylon, and Yahweh's glory is there. And it just begs the question, wait a minute, what is God's glory doing in Babylon? That's how the book opens. And so what you find out throughout these first chapters of the book here, as Ezekiel, he's called and commissioned to speak against the people of Israel. And it's very similar to the other books. The people of Israel have abandoned Yahweh. They've been faithless. They've been following other gods. And so God's going to bring another wave of judgment and exile against his people. The next main section of the book here, the theme of Yahweh's glory, is taken up again. And Ezekiel has this vision of what's going on back in Jerusalem. Remember, he lives in Babylon. Back in Jerusalem, it's like he takes a little virtual tour of the temple in Jerusalem. And he sees that the Israelites have set up, not just they're worshiping other gods in the temple, they've actually set up idols of other gods in Yahweh's temple. And so at the very end of the section here, of this vision that Ezekiel has in chapter 11, literally Yahweh's glory, which is exactly what he saw here in chapter 1, it picks up and leaves the temple. God leaves the temple. And what's essentially happening here is Ezekiel is saying, things have gotten so bad in Israel, the injustice, the idolatry, that Yahweh he's left his people. He's left the whole point of building the tabernacle was for God to dwell among his people, and he's leaving. Things have gotten so bad. And so these first sections of the book here, they're setting up a huge problem for the storyline of the Old Testament. Remember, God's going to use these people to bless the nations. That's why he came to dwell among them in the temple. But essentially through their sin and unfaithfulness, they've driven out Yahweh from the temple. And so Ezekiel's sitting here in Babylon, and God's presence has gone to Babylon. That's what Ezekiel sees right here. And so that kind of issues Ezekiel into the next main part of the book here. And these are some of more of the strangest chapters. Ezekiel was a weird dude. That's all I have to say about that. So he tells a lot of parables and allegories about the people of Israel, and he uses stories about like two sisters, or a story about a tree, or a story about a burnt stick. I mean, all these bizarre little images. He will tell a little story, and then he'll develop how it teaches us something about the story of Yahweh and Israel. So the two sisters were married, and then they left their husbands. The tree was planted by God, and then the tree sent out its roots towards other gods, and so on. So this is a long section here, essentially, similar to Jeremiah and so on, just accusing the people of unfaithfulness and of injustice, and describing just how deep their apostasy has been in turning away from Yahweh. And that's what led to Yahweh leaving the temple in Jerusalem in the first place. Just like in Isaiah and just like in Jeremiah, the prophet focuses not just on the people of Israel, but also on the nations. And so one by one, Ezekiel targets the nations of their day, the people of Egypt, the people of Tyre and Sidon to the north. And he brings more accusations, because these nations were guilty of injustice and oppression of the poor and so on. And so these first 32 chapters here of Ezekiel are pretty intense. They are pretty accusatory. There's not a lot of good news in these chapters. But it gives a very powerful expression of God's justice against human sin and unfaithfulness and injustice. And it raises the key question then that will have to be answered in the next part of the book here, is if Yahweh has abandoned his temple, does that mean he's abandoned his promises to Israel completely? What about God's promises to Abraham? What about the promise of the Messiah? How are those things going to happen if the people are disobedient and Yahweh's going to bring judgment on them? And those are the questions that are answered in the second main half of the book. So we'll see you next time, and we'll wrap up the book of Ezekiel.